Hello and welcome. My name is Joe O'Mara. I'm the head of aviation finance with KPMG. And on behalf of KPMG and Airline Economics, I'm delighted to be joined by Patrick Den Elzen, who's the CEO of Arena Aviation Capital. Patrick is joining us for the purposes of our 2022 Aviation Leaders Report. And I should say we are recording this 4 days before Christmas. Patrick, thanks for joining us for this. Before we get into the meat of the discussion, do you want to tell our watchers a little bit about Arena?
Thank you, Joe, for giving me the opportunity to speak. Arena Aviation Capital is a fully integrated and full-service aircraft asset investment management company. So we take care of aircraft from cradle to grave. We originate deals, we manage aircraft, we then either lease them out again or sell them or part them out for a diversified investor base. Over the past 8 years in our existence, we have bought about 100 aircraft worth 3.6 billion. And at this moment in time, we manage 64 aircraft.
And Patrick, can I ask you, we're now 21 months into this crisis. How have you seen over the course of 2021 airline customer performance evolve?
Well, let's say erratically is probably the best way to describe that. There is still this tremendous bifurcation between airlines that everybody will believe we're going to survive this crisis, no matter how it pans out. Excuse me, and those of which that is less certain. And for those airlines that the outcome is less certain, debt financing is far less easily available, which means that from our point of view, one of the areas that we care most about, of course, is the trading market and the investment market. And so what we can see is that liquidity for aircraft on lease to those less fortunate credits is almost non-existent. And that must, and then again, the trading activity for aircraft on lease to airlines that are considered to be survivors, that trading is very liquid and yields are very compressed in that area. The number of airlines migrating from the one category to the other, I think, is very, very limited and has been over the past 21 months. So yes, financial performance of airline customers is really characterized by this bifurcation.
And if you look at it on the opportunity side, say you have that bifurcation, but you still probably have opportunities out there, and we've seen them, and you would have seen them in what you've done over the last kind of 18 months or so. Where are you seeing those opportunities come up? So, and is there a possibility as we hopefully progress along with the recovery that we see more airline 2.0s, so more new startups, again, pushing out potential opportunities?
Oh, yes, very, very definitely. Especially over the past, let's say, 6 to 8 months, so a little bit into this crisis, when more and more aircraft became available, and it appeared to become more clear how we were going to get out of this crisis, with large-scale vaccination programs. This was all before Omicron, mind you. You saw startup carriers, especially in the charter area and ACMI business. We've seen some scheduled airline startups, some of them actually quite big. So yes, we have seen investors and airline entrepreneurs take advantage of the current set of circumstances.
And looking maybe broadly at the leasing market, we have seen, we talked about airline distress and the challenge on the balance sheet side they've had, being capital constrained. There has been a clear shift in the popularity of leasing. For a long time, we've talked about whether we'll get to that kind of 50% threshold. I think there's acceptance that it's at that threshold and probably funding more for new deliveries. Do you see this being a longer term step change for how popular leasing will be for airlines going into the future?
I think it's going to, whether we are ever going to revert back to the 50-50 or 45-55% balance between leasing and owning of aircraft, I don't know long term. But for the immediate term, let's say for the next 5 to 7 years, I see no reason why leasing would become any less popular, simply because airlines just don't have the access to capital that they need in order to fund their delivery programs or to fund their fleet rejuvenation programs, especially with this new focus on ESG, which means that there's going to be more focus on newer aircraft and that are more capital intensive, obviously, than older aircraft. So that in combination with weakened balance sheets, I see no reason why airlines would not continue to rely very heavily on aircraft leasing. And not to mention, by the way, a third factor that has always been important for aircraft leasing, which is the flexibility that it offers airlines to change their fleet composition, right? That is going to be even more important over the next coming years, because the way we're going to get out of this crisis is going to be so erratic and with so many regional differences, that for airlines to retain that flexibility that operating leasing offers them is going to be even more important than it was in the past. So for a number of reasons, I think that aircraft leasing will be the dominant means of deploying or acquiring aircraft for the airline industry.
And on the pricing side, with respect to the leasing market, anecdotally, it seemed you go back maybe outside of COVID, there was a bit of a bounce in lease rate factors. And I know that's not the only piece. So let's say a bit of a bounce in just general return conditions or return metrics. And that seems to have tightened again to probably where things were pre-COVID. Would that be your experience, or what have you found on the competition and pricing side?
Well, I think that it is clear, again, as a result of this bifurcation, where the not so fortunate airlines are simply very difficult to debt finance for an investor. So that automatically, reduces the space, the investable space, significantly. And that in combination with abundantly available capital and capital markets, among them the ABS market, that have come back so quickly and so expectantly as well, has led to a lot of supply of capital. And so that combination, of course, can only have one effect, and that is a very significant compression of yields. I think it's in our experience is that for newer aircraft on lease to good credits, yields are already below what they were before COVID. And it is a little bit uncertain as we speak today, which, as you said, is 4 days before Christmas, what this new Omicron variant will do to the industry, because that threatens to really change the playing field again. And it might deter some investors. But if that is of a transitory nature, then I don't see any reason why yields would start to widen again anytime soon.
Can I ask you then your thoughts around maybe the traditional aviation debt market? We saw the banks retrench at the outset of COVID. It seems to have opened up a little bit more. We'll come to the capital markets in a second. And we've also seen probably a not insignificant number of alternative lenders enter the space in the last 18 months or so. What's your view on where that debt market currently sits?
The commercial traditional banks that were always part of the spectrum of lenders in this industry historically have taken a long time to come back, and there's I guess a number of reasons for that. And that space has largely been taken by the alternative lenders. But I think that what we observe, at least, is that banks are coming back slowly. Some Japanese banks are active again, some Korean banks are active again. French banks have never really been completely inactive, but they've been very slow to become a bit more proactively doing new business. So it is coming back, and it's a good thing because commercial banks tend to be a bit cheaper than the alternative lenders are. The return requirements are a little bit lower. On the flip side of that is, unfortunately, they're also a bit more conservative than alternative lenders. So they have their place, and they are slowly regaining that place. I see them as, like I said, somewhat cheaper, but somewhat more conservative than the typical alternative debt provider. But the alternative debt provider have clearly taken a big piece of the market, and I see no reason why that will change anytime soon.
And on the capital markets, maybe in the unsecured space, I know it's not an area you guys play directly in at the moment, but if you look at the ability of the IG rated lessors to raise huge sums at very, very, very surprisingly favorable rates has been hugely impressive. Your thoughts on what that means for the wider aviation finance space and the sustainability of keeping, maybe not that rate because we're in a rising interest rate environment, but maintaining the level of spread they've achieved over the last 18 months or so. Your thoughts on that side?
Yeah, I think that's the traditional aircraft investment model, where you buy an aircraft or maybe a few aircraft and then you add some commercial debt to it, and then you make reasonable returns. I think that model is no longer works, at least not today, and I don't see the set of circumstances that make it so difficult to work go away anytime soon. Relatively low interest rates, a lot of capital being available, very efficient and very accessible capital markets. All that make it almost impossible for somebody to use a traditional aircraft leasing investment model to make a decent return. The exception is with ABS. It is possible to build up a portfolio in a relatively short period of time, and then do an asset-based securitization. And then you have access to those capital markets yourself, at more or less equal terms, not exactly, but close to terms and conditions that the large mega lessors have access to unsecured funding as well. So there is a way for smaller leasing companies and smaller investors to effectively compete in that space, but it's not easy.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting point in the ABS, and you kind of look at ABS and say, sometimes the headline rates are higher than those unsecured, but you can leverage well, right? You can go up significantly around the capital stack and the ABCs. On ABS, were you surprised at how quickly it came back? In that, when that market shut after the financial crash, closed for about 5 years. Here we had, I'd say, a 12-month shutdown, and then we've seen a dozen deals this year. I know we're not back to tradable E-note, but you kind of sense we're on that track. Your thoughts on how quickly that market's come back and where you see it going over the next 12 months?
Well, it's been surprising to many people, obviously. But if you think about it in hindsight, it's not that surprising because, forgetting for a moment about the way aircraft are financed, the fact that the aircraft leasing industry was able to pull through so well, relatively speaking, that was unexpected by itself. So I guess that the product of the aircraft, of investing in aircraft finance, no matter where in the capital stack you invest in, whether it's debt or equity, the resilience of aircraft investment, even in the worst of downturns, because COVID obviously, if there was a black swan event, this would be it. So the aircraft leasing product held up as an asset class, has held up quite well. And looking at ABSs in particular, with the exception, of course, of some poorly structured or poor quality ABSs, and with the exception of some very highly levered subclasses, most of the A and the B and in fact some of the C notes held up quite well. And in hindsight, it's no surprise that people observed that and saw, well, if A, B, and C notes even can withstand something like COVID, then that might be a perfectly acceptable asset to invest in.
And can I ask you on the investor side, obviously, given the activity you're involved in, you talk a lot across the investor population with those that come to aviation finance, and that would include traditional players that we've seen in aviation finance around Japanese capital, US private equity, which you partnered with in the recent past. Your thoughts, have you seen any trends post-COVID on new or different capital coming at the space? Or is it just the same types of investors? So new players, but still US private equity, new players, maybe still Japanese capital. Your thoughts around the investor base that you have seen display interest in the last kind of year and a half?
Yeah, I think that what you say is actually true. It's the same. It comes from the same markets as historically, like Japanese tax equity is back surprisingly fast, actually, in hindsight. US private equity was always going to be the usual suspect for coming in when the crisis is, it is headiest, as it were. And it was no surprise that we saw private equity firms coming in 2000, late 2020, beginning of 2021, including with one of them that we teamed up with. The dislocation that makes aircraft investment investable for those kind of players, US private equity, that window of opportunity has very quickly disappeared, of course. Now that ABS markets have come back so quickly, and yields are compressing so quickly. And so I think we're finding ourselves back in a situation that we were in 2019, where in order to be competing effectively, you need to have access to very competitively and efficiently priced capital. And that's not typically US private equity. So I would expect those to slowly disappear from the scene again, and being replaced by more traditional financial institutions. And I would not be surprised if over the next couple of years, you would see more influx of pension funds and other insurance companies and other financial institutions that would normally be far more risk averse and would maybe not touch aviation, but are now able to rely on the fact that even COVID was not able to destroy this asset class, and therefore it is secure enough and stable enough for people like insurance companies or pension funds to invest in. So I expect more money to come from that corner. There's one qualification there, though, at least in not so much in the States yet or in America, but certainly in Europe, there is an increasing focus on ESG. And that might stand in the way of pension funds and insurance companies, mostly pension funds, by the way, entering this market big scale.
Can I ask you to pull to get lots of interesting stuff in there and to pull on a couple of threads on it? We'll go back to ESG stuff in just a second. But in the conversations you're having with the investor base over the more recent past, where's the focus on, right? So you obviously they're talking to you as an experienced asset manager. Are they delving into airline credits? Are they delving into your ability to debt raise? Are they talking in any experience way or on the metal? Where have you found investor focus and investor sophistication?
Initially credit, and slowly more asset, and that is logical, because at the beginning, or let's say at the earlier stages of the pandemic, without any knowledge on how we're going to get out of this, but with the conviction that long term we will get out of it. Long term, aircraft values will regain their residual value performance. In those circumstances, you have to look at the credit, because you want to make sure that, and your investors will look at it as well, because they want to make sure that you can actually reach that stage when you're out of the pandemic, and you can rely on the residual value assumption. as time went by and it became more clear, or it appeared to become more clear how we were going to get out of this pandemic with all the vaccination programs coming online, and with all the debt being available at relatively attractive and efficient terms and conditions, the focus became more on, what is the aircraft type that I should be investing in. So people started to believe that, or investors saw that aircraft were slowly being leased again, that PBH rates or PBH deals that were done were slowly being replaced by fixed rate deals. And that means that you can take a bit more risk and focus more on the asset than the credit.
To probe maybe an ancillary point to that, what are you seeing as the most investable metal? So obviously, look, clearly narrow body, probably new tech, but just curious more broader than that, where are you seeing pockets of interest and value? And that probably speaks to the trading environment as well as the opportunities that are out there on the metal side.
Yeah. Well, that has obviously changed over time as well over the past 18, 21 months, where initially it was all about new and newer aircraft on lease to good credits and long leases, which is the most risk-averse proposition you can invest in. Whereas now it has gone as far as people investing in naked aircraft, even wide-body aircraft, based on the assumption, speculative assumption, that they will find a home for it and they will find a lessee for it, and that over time that investment will turn out to be a very profitable one. The recent outbreak of Omicron and what it might or might not do to the recovery pace of this industry, I think points at how risky that strategy can be.
No, I think that's fair comment. And circling back on the ESG one, kind of interesting comments has been going through the interviews for this report around a little bit. Yeah. Is it having an impact on your ability to raise debt in the market? Probably not at the moment, right? Given the quantum of capital that's out there, but an increased investor focus. And that seems to be sinking in to the comments you're making, Patrick. Curious to see, when you're chatting to investors, just how high up the agenda ESG is and just how that interplays with a sector that'll never be green. It'll be better, maybe in new tech, but it'll never be green. So very curious in your thoughts over where you see that impacting.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic of conversation, and one that we're debating internally a lot. And one of the questions that we're asking ourselves is, if we want to raise capital, should we raise capital that is sort of ESG compliant, or is it sort of an aviation green fund? Does such a thing exist? And if so, how would you structure that? And I'm sure that many people in our industry are racking the brains like we do on how you can do that. Because if you are able to do that, you can access a pool of capital that is potentially very competitively priced and very big. So yes, we're thinking about it a lot. It is easier than it was 2 years ago, and that is because we now are slowly seeing the results of the taxonomy topic being addressed in the EU. We're seeing a consolidation, I would say, of institutions and what they and types of ratings that they issue. So what does it mean to be ESG compliant for an airline or a company or any entity really? Not too long ago, there were maybe a dozen institutions that could give you sort of a rating to testify to that. Now there's maybe 3 or 4 that are generally accepted as reliable and credible. So that helps. It is also now more clear what the industry itself is prepared to do, or what they are looking to do to address the decarbonization challenge. And airlines subscribing to the net zero emission by 2050 target more and more airlines signing up to that. That helps as well. But ultimately, what is ESG or what is green is in the eye of the beholder. So it's still a somewhat opaque and unclear scene that we're in. I think there's a couple of aspects to investing in cargo aircraft. First of all, there was always going to be a significant growth of the cargo business because of the e-commerce growth globally, right? And that has only been accelerated by the pandemic. That growth that was already predicted has been accelerated by the pandemic. I don't think the pandemic itself has a lasting, well, one would hope that the pandemic itself does not have a lasting impact on how the cargo market is being structured, because that would mean that we cannot rely on belly capacity anytime soon anymore. And that touches on the second aspect of how the pandemic affects the cargo business, and that is that narrow body freighters and wide body freighters are different beasts, and the wide body freighter market was always directly competed against, I would say, by belly capacity in intercontinental routes. And whether it comes back is, of course, a function of how this pandemic will play out and how fast. And then the third aspect is that a lot of people jumped on the cargo conversion bandwagon, as it were, because they saw that as the only way out to avoid having to crystallize very significant losses on their investment, on their book values, as it were. And you can really question if the window of opportunity is not already closed for making sensible investment in conversions. I think the jury is still out on that, but I think there's more and more concern in the industry that maybe there's too many aircraft being converted, and long term we might be looking at an oversupply of freighter aircraft. But that's for the longer term. For the shorter term, I think their demand is still very healthy. Although we do see in the narrow body freighter market segment, we do see rentals go down already, by, let's say, about 20% already, relative to what they were a year ago. So in other words, a brand new converted NG is now leasing for about 30 to 40,000 less than it was a year ago. And we see that trend going on for a little bit longer. Yeah,
so perhaps not the bright spot that some people think, right, or how it will play out. Can I ask you, Patrick, then, just in closing, right, and appreciating the challenging situation we are with the new variant, but what are your optimism levels like as you look out over 2022? We have clearly come through 21 months like we never expected, but there were and continue to be signs that a recovery is real and is happening. The pace, as you mentioned, and the bifurcation of that recovery is challenged. But as you look out into next year, how optimistic are you looking at the sector as a whole and the activities that Arena will be undertaking?
Yeah, despite this Omicron variant that is spooking a lot of people at the moment, I think that we may see somewhat slower recovery in 2022 than we had hoped a couple of weeks ago. But I don't see a reason not to be optimistic generally about recovering of this industry. It's unfortunate that we always seem to have to adjust our expectations downward as time goes by, and there's a big risk that I have to do that as well. Again, but from where I sit here today, I think recovery will continue at least, and it may not be back to normal if we get there by next year or the year after, but certainly by 2024, 2025, I see no reason why we should not be back at where we were in And I'm not saying anything spectacular there. I think that's most people's expectation at this point in time.
Yeah, no, look, on that mostly optimistic outlook, and I think that's inconsistent with the people we're chatting to. Look, we know when people can return to fly, they do return to fly, and it is a timing piece around it. Patrick, I'd like to thank you for your time and insights today, and wish both you and Arena the very best in 2022. Thanks again.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for being here.